Then, with a factitious doctrine of sin, a factitious holiness also was inculcated, and people were led to believe that all baptized persons were necessarily regenerated. Had the Roman Empire of the West remained under one civil head, backed by that civil head, the Bishop of Rome might very soon have infected all parts of that empire with the pagan corruption he had evidently given himself up to propagate. Considering the cruelty with which Jovinian and all who opposed the pagan doctrines in regard to marriage and abstinence were treated by the pontifex of Rome under favor of the imperial power, it may easily be seen how serious would have been the consequences to the cause of truth in the Western Empire, had this state of matters been allowed to pursue its natural course. But now the great Lord of the Church interfered. The revolt of the Goths and the sack of Rome by Alaric the Goth in 410 gave that shock to the Roman Empire which issued by 476 in its complete upbreaking and the extinction of the imperial power. Although therefore in pursuance of the policy previously inaugurated, the Bishop of Rome was formally recognized by an imperial edict in 445 as head of all the churches of the West, all bishops being commanded to hold and observe as a law whatever it should please the Bishop of Rome to ordain or decree. The convulsions of the empire, and the extinction soon thereafter of the imperial power itself, to a large extent nullified the disastrous effects of this edict. The earth's opening its mouth, then, in other words, the breaking up of the Roman Empire into so many independent sovereignties, was a benefit to true religion, and prevented the flood of error and corruption that had its source in Rome from flowing as fast and as far as it would otherwise have done. When many different wills in the different countries were substituted for the one will of the emperor, on which the sovereign pontiff leaned, the influence of that pontiff was greatly neutralized. Under these circumstances, says Gieseler, referring to the influence of Rome in the different kingdoms into which the empire was divided, under these circumstances the popes could not directly interfere in ecclesiastical matters, and their communications with the established church of the country depended entirely on the royal pleasure. The papacy at last overcame the effects of the earthquake, and the kingdoms of the West were engulfed in that flood of error that came out of the mouth of the dragon. But the overthrow of the imperial power, when so zealously propping up the spiritual despotism of Rome, gave the true church in the West a lengthened period of comparative freedom which otherwise it could not have had. The Dark Ages would have come sooner, and the darkness would have been more intense, but for the Goths and the Vandals and the political convulsions that attended their eruptions. They were raised up to scourge an apostatizing community, not to persecute the saints of the Most High, though these too may have occasionally suffered in the common distress. The hand of Providence may be distinctly seen in that at so critical a moment the earth opened its mouth and helped the woman. To return, however, to the memorable period when the pontifical title was bestowed on the Bishop of Rome. The circumstances in which that pagan title was bestowed upon Pope Damasus were such as might have been not a little trying to the faith and integrity of a much better man than he. Though paganism was legally abolished in the Western Empire of Rome, yet in the City of the Seven Hills it was still rampant, insomuch that Jerome, who knew it well, writing about Rome at this very period, calls it the sink of all superstition. The consequence was that while everywhere else throughout the empire the imperial edict for the abolition of paganism was respected, in Rome itself it was, to a large extent, a dead letter. Symmachus, the prefect of the city, and the highest patrician families, as well as the masses of the people, were fanatically devoted to the old religion, and therefore the emperor found it necessary, in spite of the law, to connive at the idolatry of the Romans. How strong was the hold that paganism had in the imperial city, even after the fire of Vesta was extinguished, and state support was withdrawn from the Vestals, the reader may perceive from the following word of Gibbon. The image and altar of victory were indeed removed from the Senate house, but the emperor yet spared the statues of the gods which were exposed to public view. 424 temples or chapels still remain to satisfy the devotion of the people, and in every quarter of Rome the delicacy of the Christians was offended by the fumes of idolatrous sacrifice. Thus strong was paganism in Rome, even after state support was withdrawn about 376 AD. But look forward only about 50 years and see what has become of it. The name of paganism has almost entirely disappeared, insomuch that the younger Theodosius, in an edict issued AD 423, uses these words: "The pagans that remain, although now we may believe there are none." The words of Gibbon in reference to this are very striking. While fully admitting that notwithstanding the imperial laws made against paganism, no peculiar hardships were imposed on the sectaries who credulously received the fables of Ovid and obstinately rejected the miracles of the gospel, he expressed his surprise at the rapidity of the revolution that took place among the Romans from paganism to Christianity. The ruin of paganism, he says, and his dates are from AD 378, the year when the Bishop of Rome was made Pontifex, to 395. The ruin of paganism in the age of Theodosius is perhaps the only example of the total extirpation of any ancient and popular superstition, and may therefore deserve to be considered as a singular event in the history of the human mind. After referring to the hasty conversion of the Senate, he thus proceeds: "The edifying example of the Anician family in embracing Christianity was soon imitated by the rest of the nobility. The citizens who subsisted by their own industry, and the populace who were supported by the public liberality, filled the churches of the Lateran and Vatican with an incessant throng of devout proselytes. The decrees of the Senate, which proscribed the worship of idols, were ratified by the general consent of the Romans. The splendor of the Capitol was defaced, and the solitary temples were abandoned to ruin and contempt. Rome submitted to the yoke of the gospel. The generation that arose in the world after the promulgation of imperial laws was attracted within the pale of the Catholic Church, and so rapid, yet so gentile was the fall of paganism, that only 28 years after the death of Theodosius the Elder, the faint and minute vestiges were no longer visible to the eye of the legislator. Now how can this great and rapid revolution be accounted for? Is it because the word of the Lord has had free course and been glorified? Then what means the new aspect that the Roman Church has now begun to assume? In exact proportion as paganism has disappeared from without the Church, in the very same proportion it appears within it. Pagan dresses for the priests, pagan festivals for the people, pagan doctrines and ideas of all sorts are everywhere in vogue. The testimony of the same historian who has spoken so decisively about the rapid conversion of the Romans to the profession of a gospel is not less decisive on this point. In his account of the Roman Church under the head of Introduction of Pagan Ceremonies, he speaks thus: "As the objects of religion were gradually reduced to the standard of the imagination, the rites and ceremonies were introduced that seemed most powerfully to affect the senses of the vulgar. If in the beginning of the 5th century Tertullian or Lactantius had been suddenly raised from the dead to assist at the festival of some popular saint or martyr, they would have gazed with astonishment and indignation on the profane spectacle which had succeeded to the pure and spiritual worship of a Christian congregation. As soon as the doors of a church were thrown open, they must have been offended by the smoke of incense, the perfume of flowers, and the glare of lamps and tapers, which diffused at noonday a gaudy, superfluous, and, in their opinion, sacrilegious light." Gibbon has a great deal more to the same effect. Now, can anyone believe that this was accidental? No. It was evidently the result of that unprincipled policy of which, in the course of this inquiry, we have already seen such innumerable instances on the part of the papacy. Gibbon distinctly admits this. "It must ingenuously be confessed," says he, "that the ministers of the Catholic Church imitated the profane model they were so impatient to destroy." Pope Damasus saw that in a city preeminently given to idolatry, if he was to maintain the gospel pure and entire, he must be willing to bear the cross, to encounter hatred and ill will, to endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. On the other hand, he could not be equally see that if bearing the title around which, for so many ages, all the hopes and affections of paganism had clustered, he should give its votaries reason to believe that he was willing to act up to the original spirit of that title, he might count on popularity, aggrandizement, and glory. Which alternative, then, was Damasus likely to choose? The man that came into the bishopric of Rome as a thief and a robber over the dead bodies of above 100 of his opponents could not hesitate as to the election he should make. The result shows that he had acted in character, that in assuming the pagan title of Pontifex he had set himself at whatever sacrifice of truth to justify his claims to the title in the eyes of the pagans, as the legitimate representative of their long line of pontiffs. There is no possibility of accounting for the facts on any other supposition. It is evident also that he and his successors were accepted in that character by the pagans, who in flocking into the Roman Church and rallying around the new pontiff did not change their creed or worship, but brought both into the Church along with them. The reader has seen how complete and perfect is the copy of the old Babylonian paganism, which under the patronage of the popes has been introduced into the Roman Church. He has seen that the God whom the papacy worships as the Son of the Highest is not only, in spite of a divine command, worshipped under the form of an image, made, as in the days of avowed paganism, by art and man's device, but that attributes are ascribed to him which are the very opposite of those which belong to the merciful Saviour, but which attributes are precisely those which were ascribed to Moloch, the fire god, or Allah Mahozim, the god of fortifications. He has seen that about the very time when the Bishop of Rome was invested with the pagan title of Pontifex, the Saviour began to be called Ichthys, or the fish, thereby identifying him with Dagon, the fish god, and that after since advancing step by step, as circumstances would permit, what has gone under the name of the worship of Christ has just been the worship of that same Babylonian divinity, with all its rites and pomps and ceremonies, precisely as in ancient Babylon. Lastly, he has seen that the sovereign pontiff of the so-called Christian Church of Rome has so wrought out the title bestowed upon him in the end of the 4th century, as to be now dignified as for centuries he has been with the very names of blasphemy originally bestowed on the old Babylonian pontiffs. The reader who has seen the first edition of this work will perceive that in the above reasoning I found nothing upon the formal appointment by Gratian of the Pope as Pontifex, with direct authority over the pagans, as was done in that edition. That is not because I do not believe that such an appointment was made, but because at the present moment some obscurity rests on the subject. The Reverend Barcroft Bokey, a very learned minister of the Church of England in Ceylon, India, when in this country, communicated to me his researches on the subject, which have made me hesitate to assert that there was any formal authority given to the Bishop of Rome over the pagans by Gratian. Now, if the circumstance in which the Pope has risen to all this height of power and blasphemous assumption be compared with a prediction in Daniel, which for want of the true key has never been understood, I think the reader will see how literally in the history of the Popes of Rome that prediction has been fulfilled. The prediction to which I allude is that which refers to what is commonly called the willful king, as described in Daniel 11:36 and following. That willful king is admitted on all hands to be a king that arises in gospel times in Christendom, but is generally seen supposed to be an infidel antichrist, not only opposing the truth but opposing popery as well and everything that assumed the very name of Christianity. But now let the prediction be read in the light of the facts that have passed in review before us, and it will be seen how very different is the case. Verse 36. And the king shall do according to his will, and shall exalt himself, magnify himself above God, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. So far, these words give an exact description of the papacy, with its pride, its blasphemy, and forced celibacy and virginity. But the words that follow, according to any sense that the commentators have put upon them, have never hitherto been found capable of being made to agree either with the theory that the Pope was intended, or any other theory whatever. Let them, however, only be literally rendered and compared with the papal history, and all is clear, consistent, and harmonious. The inspired seer has declared that in the Church of Christ some one shall arise who shall not only aspire to a great height, but shall actually reach it, so that he shall do according to his will. His will shall be supreme in opposition to all law, human and divine. Now if this king is to be a pretended successor of the fisherman of Galilee, the question would naturally arise, how could it be possible that he should ever have the means of rising to such a height of power? The words that follow give a distinct answer to that question. He shall not regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in establishing himself shall he honor the God of fortifications, Allah Mahozim, and a God whom his fathers knew not, shall he honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he make into strengthening bulwarks for himself the people of a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and he shall divide the land for gain. The reader will observe it is not said he shall not worship any god. The reverse is evident, but that he shall not regard any, that his own glory is highest end. Such is the prophecy. Now this is exactly what the Pope did. Self-aggrandizement has ever been the grand principle of the papacy, and in establishing himself it was just the god of fortifications that he honored. The worship of that god he introduced into the Roman Church, and by doing so he converted that which otherwise would have been a source of weakness to him into the very tower of his strength. He made the very paganism of Rome by which he was surrounded the bulwark of his power. When once it was proved that the Pope was willing to adopt paganism under Christian names, the pagans and pagan priests would be his most hearty and staunch defenders. And when the Pope began to wield lordly power over the Christians, who were the men that would recommend, that he would promote, that he would advance to honor and power? Just the very people most devoted to the worship of the strange God, which he had introduced into the Christian Church. Gratitude and self-interest alike would conspire to this. Jovinian and all who resisted the pagan ideas and pagan practices were excommunicated and persecuted. Those only who were heartily attached to the apostasy, and none could now be more so than genuine pagans, were favored and advanced. Such men were sent from Rome in all directions, even as far as Britain, to restore the reign of paganism. They were magnified with high titles, the lands were divided among them, and all to promote the gain of the Romish see, to bring in Peter's pence from the ends of the earth to the Roman pontiff. But it is still further said that the self-magnifying king was to honor a god whom his fathers knew not, with gold and silver and precious stones. The principle on which transubstantiation was founded is unquestionably a Babylonian principle, but there is no evidence that that principle was applied in the way in which it has been by the papacy. Certain it is that we have evidence that no such wafer god as the papacy worships was ever worshipped in pagan Rome. Was any man ever so mad, says Cicero, who himself was a Roman augur and a priest, was any man ever so mad as to take that which he feeds on for a god? Cicero could not have said this if anything like wafer worship had been established in Rome. But what was too absurd for pagan Romans is no absurdity at all for the Pope. The host, or consecrated wafer, is the great god of the Romish Church. That host is enshrined in a box adorned with gold and silver and precious stones, and thus it is manifest that a god whom even the Pope's pagan fathers knew not, he at this day honors in the very way that the terms of the prediction imply that he would. Thus in every respect, when the Pope was invested with the pagan title of Pontifex, and set himself to make that title a reality, he exactly fulfilled the prediction of Daniel recorded more than 900 years ago. But to return to the apostolic symbols, it was out of the mouth of the fiery dragon that the flood of water was discharged. The Pope, as he is now, was at the close of the 4th century the only representative of Belshazzar, or Nimrod on the earth. For the pagans manifestly accepted him as such. He was equally, of course, the legitimate successor of the Roman dragon of fire. When therefore, on being dignified with the title of Pontifex, he set himself to propagate the old Babylonian doctrine of baptismal regeneration, then was just a direct and formal fulfillment of the divine words, that the great fiery dragon should cast out of his mouth a flood of water to carry away the woman with a flood. He, and thus who cooperated with him in this cause, paved the way for the erecting of that tremendous civil and spiritual despotism which began to stand forth full in the face of Europe in AD 606, when amid the convulsions and confusions of the nations tossed like a tempestuous sea, the Pope of Rome was made universal bishop, and when the 10 chief kingdoms of Europe recognized him as Christ's vicar upon earth, the only center of unity, the only source of stability to their thrones. Then by his own act and deed, and by the consent of the universal paganism of Rome, he He was actually the representative of Dagon, and as he bears upon his head and unto this day the mitre of Dagon, so there is reason to believe he did then. It is from this period only that the well-known 1260 days can begin to be counted, for not before did the Pope appear as head of the ten-horned beast and head of the universal church. The reader will observe that though the beast above referred to has passed through the sea, it still retains its primitive characteristic. The head of the apostasy at first was Kronos the Horned One. The head of the apostasy is Kronos still, for he is the beast with the 7 heads and 10 horns. Could there then be a more exact fulfillment of chapter 13:1? And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea of nations, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns or powers 10 crowns or kingdoms, and upon his heads the names of blasphemy. And I saw one of this head, as it had been wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, of the Roman Empire, and all the world wondered after the beast, because the beast now from a physical Roman imperial power has turned into a spiritual Babylon replacement church power.